window pane rattled in its warped frame, a single drop of rain slipping down the dirty glass like a tear no one dared claim. Clara Boone sat at the edge of the cot, her needle paused mid-stitch, thread trembling between two fingers. She wasn't praying, but she held still like a woman waiting on judgment, and maybe that's what it was. Judgment, folded in the creased letter on the table. The fire in the corner stove had long since guttered out. Only the smell of scorched coal clung to the walls and boiled potatoes, and time. She didn't reread it. Didn't need to. Not the type of woman a man needs out here. Too young, too soft. Don't write again. The words, though once printed with care, had worn thin from her fingers. Oil and sweat had smudged the ink. What remained was memory, etched harder than ink ever could. The silence in the room was a hard thing. Not comforting, not empty, just tight, like the band of a too small dress around a chest that had outgrown pretending. Outside, a horse clopped past on muddy stone, hooves striking soft and wet. She didn't turn. It wasn't for her. They never were. Dusty Hollow didn't offer much. A post office, a lopsided saloon, a chapel with no preacher, and 4 women who scrubbed linens for coin they'd never see. Clara had learned early to keep her head low and her hands moving. Men didn't hit what they didn't notice, and women didn't ask what they didn't want answered. Still, something stirred today. A restlessness beneath her skin, like when a storm brews 3 counties over but your bones feel it first. She pricked her thumb. A bead of blood welled up, dark red against dry skin. Damn, she muttered, not in anger, but like one might speak to a mule that refused to pull. She licked the wound and threaded on, because no one paid her to bleed. The saloon doors creaked the same way the church doors did, slow and reluctant, like they too feared what came through. Clara stepped inside, not for drink, but for delivery. 2 mended shirts and a pair of trousers slung over her arm. Work for Levi called her, the drunk piano player with 3 missing fingers and a temper as crooked as his spine. He wasn't at the bar. No one was, save the barkeep polishing glasses with the edge of his sleeve, and a man she hadn't seen before, or maybe she had. He sat alone in the corner, hat brim low, one hand cradling a tin cup, the other resting near his holster, the way his fingers barely twitched near the grip. That was memory, not nervousness. Clara kept her eyes down, but her spine knew him. Not personally, but in type. Worn boots, threadbare coat, closed silence. A man who'd lost something important. She dropped the shirts on the counter and muttered to the barkeep, "Levi'll fetch 'em before sunset or they'll be gone come tomorrow." The man nodded. She turned to go, but something caught her. Not a word, just a sound soft and irregular, like the rustle of paper. She glanced sideways. The man in the corner had unfolded something from his pocket. Not a map, not a letter, a list. Names, she guessed. Men like him always had names. She stepped outside into the sharp air and the beginning of drizzle. The clouds were low pressing, not threatening, like grief that hadn't yet earned the right to cry. Her boots left faint prints in the dirt road. They'd be gone by nightfall. That evening, the lamp inside her room flickered weakly, casting long shadows on the slanted wall. Clara sat by the window now, sewing in rhythm with the rain. Not for money, just to keep her hands from trembling. Below, on the street, a wagon creaked to a stop. She didn't rise, but her breath caught in her throat. Boots, one set, slow, measured. The door of the boarding house opened. Mrs. Lark's voice nasal and impatient. Then silence. Then a knock. She opened the door half an inch, eyes meeting pale ones, gray like ash, not like steel. He held out a coat old, fraying at the seams. A man's voice, rough with disuse, said, "Mending?" She nodded. He left it on the stoop and walked away. No name, no thanks, just the scent of leather and rain. She closed the door and leaned against it, heart louder than the wind outside. For the first time in months, the silence in her room didn't press. It paused like it was listening. The coat was damp, heavy. She ran her fingers over the torn lining and found something tucked inside, folded twice. Then again, a slip of paper. 4 words, careful and plain. "You didn't have to." She pressed her hand to her chest, not because it ached, but because it finally didn't. And outside, the rain fell softer, like it too was beginning to forget how to hurt. The coat came back 2 days later, mended, pressed, folded with precision, left on the same stoop with no note attached this time. But the stitch at the inner pocket was deliberate, reinforced, as if the seamstress expected something to be hidden there again. Jonah Creed took the coat without knocking. He didn't need to thank her. The words once spoken too freely in his youth now felt too heavy for his mouth to carry. He only nodded, once, before walking off into the low light of a Montana morning thick with red dust and the breathless hush of something that hadn't happened yet. Clara watched him through the window. He didn't glance back. Men like Jonah Creed didn't look over their shoulders. Whatever followed them had already caught up long ago. The road into Dusty Hollow was a broken vein, full of bone-white stone and sagebrush creeping like fingers across wagon ruts. The wind here didn't blow, it scraped, slow and low, like the drag of boots across a pine floor after a long night of watching the fire burn low. Clara walked it every morning, down past the post office with its leaning sign, past the shuttered mercantile with dried apples hanging limp in the window. Her basket swung with the rhythm of her stride, hips steady, shoulders squared in the way of someone who'd once been taught to shrink and chose not to. When she reached the paddock outside the blacksmith's shed, she saw him again. Jonah was bent over a splintered gate post, hands bare to the splinters, hammer swinging with a rhythm more tired than angry. A half-finished fence stretched behind him, sagging in the middle like it hadn't made up its mind whether it wanted to stand or fall. She didn't speak. She knelt by the fence and picked up a stray rail, dry and light like old bone. He paused. "You don't have to," he said low. She glanced up. His voice was softer than she'd expected, worn down soft like a stone from years in the river, not velvet. "I know," she said, and wedged the rail into place. That was how it began. They didn't talk much, but they moved like people who understood that words weren't always useful. Sometimes all a man needed was someone who stayed in the same rhythm. The fence grew slowly, a jagged line across the ochre soil. Sometimes he'd hand her a nail, not looking. Sometimes she'd pass him the hammer before he reached for it. There was silence, and inside it, a kind of peace. Not comfort, just an agreement between two broken things that no longer needed fixing. As the sun sagged westward, she tied her hair back with a strip of linen torn from the hem of an old skirt. Sweat clung to her jaw, dust painted her lashes. She caught him watching her once, and he didn't look away. But neither did she. That night, she boiled beans by lamplight and sat at her table, palms still tender from fence work. The skin on her thumb had split slightly, a red line crusted with dry dirt. She pressed a damp cloth to it and stared at the folded note she'd found earlier. Not from him, from Mrs. Lark, slipped under her door. "Folks been talking. About you. About that man. You'll make trouble if you don't keep to your room." Clara didn't react right away, just folded the note in half and set it beside her plate. The beans tasted flat, but she chewed them anyway, slow, eyes on the dark square of the window where her own reflection barely looked back. Jonah's house stood a mile out, weathered wood and rusted hinges, a porch sagging slightly on one end like it had leaned into too many winters. When Clara knocked the next morning, it was with an apron tied firm and a toolbox in hand. He opened the door slowly. "Roof's slippin'," she said. He raised a brow. "How'd you know?" "Birds roosting wrong." He stepped aside. That was permission enough. Inside, the house smelled like iron, dust, and something faintly burnt, not food, just the memory of it. She noticed the cracked frame around the hearth, the unwashed pan in the basin, the nail missing from the stair rail. He didn't offer explanation. She didn't ask. By midday, she was balancing on the porch roof, hammer in hand, boots steady. He watched from below, hands crossed behind his back, unreadable. Occasionally, he'd offer up a new shingle without a word. At one point, she slipped. Just a little. His hand shot out fast, too fast for a man who moved slow. Fingers wrapped around her ankle, firm, steady. She froze. So did he. A long breath passed between them. She finished her task without another misstep. It was only after sunset, when she packed her things and stepped down the last stair, that he finally spoke again. "You always this quiet?" he asked. She shrugged. "Only when it matters." He nodded, like that made sense or like it hurt in some way he didn't want to admit. She reached the front gate before he called out, just once. "Clara." She turned. He didn't speak again, just handed her a small tin. Inside, 3 slices of dried apple, wrapped in wax paper. Nothing more was said, but as she walked home beneath a sky scraped raw with stars, the cold air pressing against her coat, she kept that tin close, not for the sweetness, but for the silence it carried. And in the back of her mind, beneath the ache and the memory and the slow unraveling of years, she wondered how long a man could go without speaking, before he forgot what it felt like to be heard. There was blood on the fence post. Not much a smear, dark and drying where the splinter had caught Jonah's palm. Clara saw it as she came up the trail, a basket of eggs balanced on her hip, morning wind tugging her shawl sideways. He didn't notice, just hammered slow, deliberate, like every nail drove something deeper into the earth. "You're bleeding," she said. He didn't look up. "Fence don't care." She set the basket down near the trough. The horses flicked their tails, restless. A storm was riding somewhere north. The air had that dry electric taste, like burnt oats and iron. She stepped closer, took his wrist. He stiffened, but didn't pull away. The gash was shallow but wide, dirt ground into it. She pulled a kerchief from her pocket, same one she'd sewn with care days earlier, and wrapped it around his hand without a word. When she tied the knot, he didn't thank her, just nodded once, and went back to work. Clara watched the line of fencing stretch across the field, half-built, like most things in the hollow, a town caught between trying and giving up. "You build alone often?" she asked. "Most times. Hard to fix things with one hand." His mouth twitched. "Harder with two if you don't trust the other." The words hung there, raw as bone. She picked up a rail and held it steady. That was her answer. The days lengthened. Not with sunshine. Montana didn't deal in kindness that way, but with wind and dust and the dull ache of muscle worked honest. Clara found herself at Jonah's more than she meant to. Mornings blurred into chores. Evenings blurred into quiet. She patched his shirts. He taught her to oil a saddle. She brought preserves. He showed her where the creek turned shallow in late summer. They didn't speak much. Didn't have to. Once, she found a bundle of scrap paper on his table. Half-words scribbled, phrases half-born. "Can't undo. Not yours to carry. Quiet is cheaper than grief." She didn't ask. She just tucked them back where they were and left fresh bread on the stove. Late one afternoon, they sat on the porch, watching clouds stack over the buttes like slow-moving herds. Jonah smoked a pipe. Clara shelled beans, the clink into the tin rhythmic. "Steady." He said, "You married once?" "Number." "Someone hurt you?" She paused. "Once. Then again. Then again." The West doesn't ask if a girl's ready, just if she can stand. He nodded, said nothing more. She didn't cry, just kept shelling beans. The wind shifted. "Why don't you ever go into town?" she asked. "Town's got too many eyes, too many mouths." She thought of Mrs. Lark's note, of the looks, of the silence behind her when she left the chapel last Sunday. "Folks say you killed a man once," she said. He didn't flinch, just tapped ash from his pipe. "Folks say a lot when the truth ain't exciting enough." "Did you?" His eyes stayed on the hills. "Yes." And then, as if a window opened inside him, he added, "He deserved it." The next day, they repaired the barn door. Jonah reached for the top hinge and winced. His shoulder stiffened. "Old break," he muttered. "Set wrong." "Want me to climb up?" she asked. He looked at her, then nodded. The ladder was crude, made of nailed pine limbs, sun-dried and bowing. She climbed slow, boots finding their place with care. From the top, the town looked farther away than it was, just a cluster of roofs and smoke trails, but the wind here felt cleaner, honest. "Hand me the nail," she said. Jonah raised it up, fingers brushing hers. Neither of them said a word. That night, a knock came to Clara's door. A boy, dirt-streaked, hat too big. "You're Miss Boone?" She nodded. He handed her a slip of paper, then ran off. She closed the door, opened the note. Just one line. "Heard he's fixing up that place. Heard he's fixing it for you." No name, no return. She read it twice, then tore it into pieces and dropped them into the stove, watching each curl and blacken in the firelight. A week later, while loading feed onto the wagon, Jonah offered her a side glance. "You keep showing up." She tightened the rope. "You keep leaving the gate open." His mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite not. As they rode toward the pasture, silence fell again, not awkward, just wide. She turned to him, eyes narrowed. "You ever plan to build a porch swing?" "Why?" "Might sit on it someday. Might have something worth watching." Jonah didn't answer. But later, after she'd gone and the sky had gone soft with dusk, he stood on the porch, staring out at the empty nails on the rafter beam. And for the first time in years, he reached for the hammer without dread in his chest. Because something was beginning to grow in the quiet between them, slow and tough, like sage after frost, and he wasn't ready to name it. But he knew it wouldn't die easy. The front door was ajar, just a crack, but Clara knew she'd latched it. She stood still at the edge of the porch, basket of washed linen in one hand, the other resting near her hip, not on a weapon, but where one might be if she carried one. A faint creak from inside. No voices, no hurried steps, just the kind of quiet that made the air feel heavy behind the ribs. She pushed the door open slow. Inside, The house smelled wrong, not foul, just different, like dust that hadn't had time to settle. The iron poker by the hearth had been moved. A dish was cracked in the basin. She moved through the space soft as a shadow, breath measured. Nothing was missing, but something had been touched. She found it in the drawer where Jonah kept his ledger, the one she wasn't supposed to know about, the corner of a folded page out of place. She opened it carefully. The handwriting wasn't his, just one line, scrawled in slanting ink. "You think silence will protect her?" No name, no signature, just the old ghost of a question she'd buried a long time ago. That evening, Jonah didn't show, not at the fence, not at the porch, not by the stable where he usually sharpened tools at sunset. Clara waited until the last light fell behind the ridge and then set out toward the barn. The path was packed hard with old hoofprints and the scent of damp cedar. The clouds hung low, orange and purple bleeding together like bruises across the sky. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called too early. She found him by the trough, sleeves rolled up, elbow deep in water. His hat was on the ground, his face wet not from sweat, not entirely. He didn't look up when she approached. "I came by earlier," she said. He nodded once. Door was open. Now he met her eyes, not startled, not guilty, just still. "There was a note," she added. "I know," he said. Silence stretched between them, taut as rawhide. Then, low, rough. "They're watching again." She didn't ask who. Some things in the West didn't need names, just shadows. He sat on the edge of the trough, water dripping from his hand. She sat beside him, keeping space but not distance. "Was it about me?" she asked. Jonah's jaw worked tight. "It's always about the ones we care about." The words hung heavy. She glanced at his hand, saw the scar there, not the fresh split from the fence. An older one, jagged and white across the meat of his palm. A wound that spoke of survival, not accident. "Who did that?" she asked. He looked down, thumb running the edge like reading Braille. "A man named Holt," he said. "Cattle thief out of Bearclaw. Had a fast draw and a slow temper. Thought he could take what he wanted." "What did he want?" Jonah didn't answer. Not with words, but the silence said enough. She felt it, not fear, but understanding. A knowing that came from living too long in someone else's idea of what you're worth. He added quieter, "That was the day I stopped asking for peace." Later, back inside his house, Jonah opened a small tin and handed her a folded scrap of cloth, something wrapped inside. She unfolded it slow. A small silver locket, dented, unpolished. Inside, a faded photograph, a woman with dark hair and tired eyes, the kind that smiled like it hurt. "My wife," he said. "Her name was Mary." Clara studied the picture, then closed it gently and passed it back. "She was beautiful," she said. He took it, but didn't pocket it, just held it, thumb brushing the surface. "She used to hum when she was scared," he said. "Never stopped the shaking, but it kept her from crying." "What happened?" "Sheriff said it was a mistake." His voice cracked like dry timber. "Said the man was drunk, thought she was someone else. Wasn't no trial, just a grave, and a name no one remembered long." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to speak but knew better than to fill silence meant for memory. "She ain't the reason I'm quiet," Jonah said, "but she's why I don't waste words." Outside, thunder rolled far off. The storm was coming closer. Clara rose. "I'll bring the windows in," she said. Jonah nodded but didn't move. She reached the door before he spoke again. "If they come," he said slow, "if they ask about you." "I'm no one's to ask about," she said, and then, after a breath, "But I won't run again." The thunder cracked harder this time, rolling across the plains like hooves. Jonah stared out the window, past the hills, toward a darkness that hadn't quite arrived but would. He didn't say it aloud, but it echoed between them anyway. They always come when the sky turns like this. The rain hadn't let up since before dawn. Not a storm, just that steady, needle-fine drizzle that seemed to soak through bone without ever making a sound. It smeared the windows of Dusty Hollow like breath on a mirror, made every boot scuff sound twice as loud against the boardwalk. Clara walked slower that morning. She'd noticed it on her way into town, the hush, not just from the rain, from the way folks looked away too fast, the way Mrs. Tillman didn't return her nod outside the post office, the way Levi, usually loud as a barrel of dry beans, had only offered a grunt when she passed the saloon. It wasn't open hostility, not yet, but it had the feel of a fire before the smoke. She reached the schoolhouse steps with the basket of fresh biscuits for the children, paused, and looked up at the gray sky. The wind caught her shawl, fluttered it behind her like the tail of something running scared. Inside, The children greeted her as always, smiles wide, hands out for warm bread and soft voices that didn't yet know what silence meant. She smiled back, steady, but she could feel it pressing through the walls. Something shifting, something wrong, and by noon, it had a name. Jonah didn't show. Not at the fence, not at the trough, not even at the ridge where he watched the storms roll in like a man waiting for judgment. Clara went to his place near sundown. The porch creaked under her boots, wet wood moaning soft as breath. She knocked once. No answer. She stepped inside. The fire was dead. The room smelled like cold ash and oil. On the table, the ledger, the tin locket, and a rifle half cleaned. The kind of arrangement that didn't happen by accident. A single note, folded, sat on the edge. They're digging. That was all. No signature. But it wasn't his handwriting. She stood still, listening. The quiet didn't feel safe anymore. That evening, she went to the chapel. Not to pray, she wasn't sure the Lord had ever answered her mother's prayers, let alone hers, but for the view. From the back pew, she could see the road in and the road out. She sat alone, hands in her lap, thumb brushing the worn hem of her skirt over and over. She thought of the note from chapter 1, the one she'd burned, the way it said, "He's fixing that place for you." The town didn't like questions it couldn't ask out loud. A woman without a man without a voice, a silence that felt too close to defiance. The door creaked. She turned slow. Reverend Horner stepped inside, or what passed for a reverend in these parts. Old, threadbare collar, whiskey breath under the scent of pipe smoke. "Miss Boone," he said. She nodded. He sat a few pews back, kept his hands folded proper. "Town's uneasy," he said. "Storm's coming and it ain't the rain." Clara waited. "They say Creed ain't what he seems." He never said he was. Rumors say he rode with Holt once. Same Holt that got himself strung up in Bear Claw. Same Holt your father owed coin to. Clara's hands stilled. "You think that's coincidence?" the Reverend asked. "I think men believe what makes them feel safer." "He's a marked man, Clara." "So am I." The Reverend sighed, long and quiet. "They come back, you know. Men like that. Not with guns always, sometimes with law, papers, claims, names they think they still own." She rose then, calm as sunrise. "If they do," she said, "I won't be the one hiding." And she left the chapel behind, her footsteps echoing hollow down the aisle. That night, she didn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the sky didn't lighten. It just hung there thick and low like it had something to say and no tongue to say it. She lit a lamp and sat by the window. The street outside was quiet, slick with wet dust and the kind of cold that crept up slow. Then hooves. She leaned closer. One rider, dark coat, wide hat, moving slow down the center of town like he owned it. Not Jonah, and not a stranger either. The way he sat, the saddle too upright, too measured. And beside him, tied by rope, a second horse, saddled but riderless. She knew what it meant before her mind caught up. Jonah was gone, or taken, or maybe he'd gone to them. Either way, someone had come to collect. She didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched as the rider disappeared around the corner toward the inn. And in her lap, her fingers curled tight around the stitched edge of the kerchief she'd given Jonah weeks ago. The stitches were fraying, but not enough to let go. Not yet. Clara found the revolver in a cedar box beneath Jonah's bed. Wrapped in old linen, the wood grip worn smooth, the barrel dull with age. Her hands trembled as she lifted it, not from fear, but memory. The smell of gun oil brought her back to a cabin half buried in Wyoming snow. Her father's voice, low and slurred, "You aim only when you mean it." She never forgot the way his breath reeked of rye, or how he'd kissed the barrel once like it was the only thing that ever listened to him. And now, here she was, holding the same weight, only colder. The rider from the night before had a name. Everyone knew it now. Hank Dutton. Used to run cattle for the rail lines till he got in bad with a card game outside Billings. Word was, he'd bought his way out by hunting men instead. The kind of man who spoke soft to women and loud to dogs. The kind that grinned when he said things he couldn't take back. He was sitting in the saloon by midday, feet up, coat unbuttoned like the whole town was just a waiting room. His hand never strayed far from his belt, and every drink he ordered came with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He asked about Clara. Not loud, just enough. Asked who she was staying with now. Asked what had become of her promised contract. Asked if folks remembered the debt her father owed and how certain things, once written, don't just vanish like dust on a porch rail. Levi Calder told her that much, whispered it through the window of the schoolhouse, his fingers shaking more than usual. "They think he's come to collect," he said. Clara didn't reply. She just closed the shutters and locked the door. Jonah returned that night, covered in road dirt, shirt torn, left eye swelling. No horse. He didn't knock, just stood in the doorway of her rooming house like a man unsure if he was welcome, or a ghost unsure if he still counted as living. Clara rose from her chair, slow. He met her eyes. They came for me, 2 of them, only one left standing. Dutton. Jonah shook his head. He sent him, watched from the ridge like a man picking apples. She stepped aside. He entered without asking. She poured water. He washed with silence. His hands trembled only once when he saw the revolver on the table. My father's, Clara said before he could ask. Jonah dried his face, eyes not leaving the gun. He won't come at night, Jonah said. Men like that want an audience. Clara nodded. Then after a beat, I want to be there. Jonah looked up. You don't need to be. I wasn't needed for a long time, but I'm still here. The next morning, the wind shifted. Dust rolled low through town, carrying with it the scent of sweat and horses and something sour beneath the sun. Clara stood outside the boarding house, revolver in hand, apron tied firm over her skirt. Jonah stood beside her, his rifle slung across his back, jaw set like a man done waiting. Word had gotten out. Townsfolk gathered in silence behind windows, beneath awnings, between slats in half-shuttered stalls. No one wanted to be seen, but no one wanted to miss what was coming, either. Dutton rode slow down Main Street, hat low, a bounty man beside him with a grin full of teeth and something sharp under his coat. The way his eyes found Clara, it was like he'd already decided where she belonged. He reined in 10 feet from them. Well now, he said, voice dry as burlap. Ain't this a picture? Jonah stepped forward. You rode in with a claim. Let's hear it. Dutton smirked. No claim, just a recollection. A contract signed by her daddy Clara Boone, owed in exchange for 2 acres, 1 mule, and a promise of labor. Man died before paying it back. That contract's ash, Jonah said, and the man who signed it is 6 feet under. Debt don't die just 'cause the debtor does, Dutton replied. He dismounted slow, hand brushing his coat. Clara raised the revolver. The bounty man tensed. Jonah lifted his rifle halfway. Dutton's grin widened. You sure about that, sweetheart? Clara stepped forward, slow and certain. I belong to no man, she said. Not dead, not living, not you. He opened his mouth maybe for a laugh, maybe a threat, but the sound never came. Because just then, the first shot split the morning. It didn't come from Clara. It came from Jonah, a clean, sharp crack that silenced everything. The bounty man stumbled back, hand clutching a smoking wrist. Dutton froze, lips bloodless. Jonah didn't lower the rifle. Clara didn't lower the gun. I won't miss next time, she said. And in that moment, under the hot eye of the Montana sun, the crowd behind shutters knew something had changed. Not because Dutton backed away, but because Clara Boone hadn't. And Jonah Creed, once a man who built fences to keep things out, had just torn one down to let her stand beside him. As the dust rose again and Dutton turned his horse without a word, the wind carried a silence through Dusty Hollow that didn't feel like fear. It felt like reckoning. The street was bare by dawn. Dust clung low to the ground, stirred only by the shift of early wind not strong enough to move it, just enough to remind you it was there. The sun hadn't breached the ridge yet, just a soft gray whisper on the edge of the sky. Not light, not dark, that hour where nothing moves unless it means to. Clara stood alone on the porch, revolver resting in her skirt pocket, hands clasped at her waist. Her breath came slow, the kind that made fog in front of your lips not from cold, but from what hadn't been said. Behind her, the door stayed open, though no one else had stepped through. The town was watching. She could feel it. Not eyes, but the weight of people pretending they weren't waiting for something to happen. The boots she wore were scuffed raw at the toes. Dust caked along the hem of her skirt. Her shawl was still damp from the basin water she'd soaked it in the one thing this morning had asked of her. She hadn't spoken since she rose. She hadn't needed to. Her fingers itched around the weight in her pocket. The revolver had never been hers. Not really. It was her father's, Foti. His hands had taught her fear long before they ever taught her control. She remembered the first time he placed it in her palm. She was 10, cold creek water dripping from her sleeves. He said, "The world'll take from you what you don't hold on to tight." Back then she thought he meant land, or coins, or pride. Now she understood. He'd meant her. The gun had no name, just 6 rounds, 1 missing, and a chamber that stuck if you turned it too fast. She didn't plan to shoot it, but she'd clean it, and hold it, and be seen with it. Jonah hadn't come out yet. He was inside, near the hearth, tying his boots with that same methodical pace he used for everything, as if time answered to him and not the other way around. She hadn't asked him not to fight. He hadn't asked her to stay behind. The night before, they'd said nothing, just sat across from one another while the oil lamp cracked, light flickering over the knots in the walls. She had watched his hands the way the left thumb never quite straightened, the callus under his ring finger from years of holding reins. She had wondered who had once held that hand like she did now. But she didn't ask, and he didn't offer. Hoofbeats echoed far off, faint, slow, deliberate. She didn't flinch. She closed her eyes and breathed deep through her nose. The air smelled of wood smoke and dry grass and horses, but beneath that, gunpowder, old, but not forgotten, the way blood smells after it's dried in sunlight. She opened her eyes. No one had turned the corner yet, but someone would. They always did. She stepped off the porch. Her boots touched the dirt and left a mark she knew wouldn't last long. The town never kept footprints unless they came with a coffin. She walked to the center of the road. The boards behind her creaked once. She didn't look. The wind tugged her braid. Somewhere down the alley a dog whined, then fell quiet. The church bell didn't ring. No need. Everyone knew what time it was. She stood still and waited, and thought of that first letter, the one folded and creased, long turned to ash in her stove. Too young, too soft, don't write again. But here she was, hard as bone, and someone had written her name again, with a gun. The hoofbeats grew louder now, real, closer. She didn't reach for the revolver. Not yet. Behind her, Jonah stepped onto the porch. His coat was buttoned, his rifle slung low across his back. The brim of his hat shadowed half his face, but his eyes were fixed on her. He didn't call out. He didn't need to. They were standing side by side before the rider even crested the hill. Dutton's horse came slow, deliberate, as if it already knew the weight of what it carried. The man rode loose in the saddle, like he'd done this before and never been stopped. His coat flapped open, revealing the glint of steel tucked low. No words were exchanged. Not yet. Words were for afterward if there was one. The sun edged over the ridge, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the dirt. And in that silence, Clara remembered something else her father once said. The quiet right before is never quiet at all. That's when your soul decides what it is. And this morning, hers already had. Dutton moved first. Not with a draw, not yet, but with a look. The kind a man gives before he kills a rattler or lays his hand on a woman's wrist too tight. He slid off the saddle slow, like he had all the time in the world, and let his boots hit the ground with a dull thud that echoed too loud in the morning hush. Jonah's stance didn't change. Neither did Clara's low. The silence held, stretched taut across the dirt like rawhide drying in the sun. Even the horses behind them stilled. Even the wind forgot its direction. I came for what's owed, Dutton said, loud enough for the town to hear. Jonah's voice came back low, but it carried. You'll leave with nothing but dust on your boots. Dutton smiled, not with humor. That woman don't belong to you. She doesn't belong to anyone, Clara said, clear, steady. He turned to her, amused. That right? She took one step forward. You think a promise made to my father holds my name? Her voice didn't crack. He's in the dirt, and that debt went with him. Maybe, Dutton said, hand drifting toward his belt, but the world don't much care what ought to be. It just takes what it can. Jonah took one step forward, placing himself half in front of her. Clara didn't move. I don't aim to shoot you, Dutton said, voice lazy, fingers near the handle, but I will, because men like me don't blink first. That's the thing, Jonah said. I ain't blinked in 15 years. And then the guns cleared leather. 2 shots rang out. Jonah's bullet hit first, a clean crack that dropped Dutton's shoulder back like someone had yanked a rope tied to his spine. The second shot missed high, wild as Dutton staggered, his pistol falling from his hand before it ever finished the aim. He went to his knees. Jonah stepped forward, rifle held loose but ready. Clara moved slower, revolver now out, held two-handed. Her breath was even, her face unreadable. Dutton spat blood into the dirt. You gonna finish it? No, Jonah said. But Clara stepped closer. Dutton raised his head. His eyes narrowed. She looked at him like she was looking at a memory she had outgrown. You thought I'd come easy, she said. His mouth curled. You don't have the guts. She knelt, slow, pressed the barrel to his temple. The crowd gasped somewhere behind them, distant and hushed. Dutton's breath hitched, and Clara leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. I've lived through worse men than you, buried pieces of them all along the trail. But if I pull this trigger, I don't carry you. You carry me. Forever." He blinked. First time she'd seen it. And she stood, turned away, left him on his knees. Jonah didn't say a word, just watched her. And behind them, the townsfolk crept out, not to cheer, not to clap, but to witness. The kind of quiet respect that only comes from knowing the line between fear and choice. Marshal Tate came through the crowd then, hat in hand, rifle at his back. "I'll see to him," he said, voice rough with the kind of weight that didn't come from the badge alone. Clara nodded once. Jonah lowered his rifle. As Dutton was led away, bleeding into the red dust he'd arrived on, Clara looked up at the sky. The sun was climbing now, slow, orange, indifferent. She turned to Jonah. He looked at her with the kind of steadiness you don't find in the wild, only in people who've lived through it. "I didn't pull the trigger," she said. He nodded. "You didn't have to." And for the first time in years, she felt like she owned the skin she stood in, not borrowed, not bargained for, not bought. Just hers, as it should have always been. And somewhere, far off in the prairie, a wind began to shift again, not violent, not cruel, just new. The sun rose clean over Dusty Hollow the morning they wed. No fanfare, no lace, just a patch of earth beneath the old oak at the edge of Jonah's land, the bark still scarred from lightning years back, a reminder that even what's been struck can keep standing. Clara wore a blue dress she'd stitched herself, thread tight and even. Jonah wore his only good coat, the one with a burn mark near the hem from a winter stove. They stood in the shade while the preacher borrowed from a passing circuit rider read from a tattered Bible with pages soft as smoke. There were no vows, not really, just glances, hands brushing, a shared breath that lingered between them like something old finally forgiven. The town didn't crowd, but a few came. Levi stood back by the fence post, hat clutched to his chest like it might blow away in the still air. Mrs. Lark, to everyone's surprise, brought a tin of shortbread and left it on the porch without a word. And the children from the schoolhouse came barefoot, each holding wildflowers in their fists like little soldiers of peace. No one spoke much, but they watched, and witnessing in a place like Dusty Hollow meant more than celebration ever could. Weeks passed. The sky stayed clear for a stretch blue as polished bone, the kind that promised dry crops and days long enough to mend every broken thing that winter hadn't already claimed. Clara moved into Jonah's house without ceremony, her basket of needles beside the hearth, her father's revolver tucked in the drawer, wrapped again in linen, not to hide, just to let it sleep. She managed the books for the ranch now, handwriting tidy, precise. She taught reading to children in the chapel 3 days a week and refused to call herself a teacher, though the children did anyway. Jonah fixed the porch swing. Every evening, they sat there, some days with coffee, some with silence, some with a jar of peach preserves passed between them like a treaty. He didn't talk more than before, but he looked at her longer. And sometimes, when he laid his hand over hers, she could feel something soften in the air, like the land itself was beginning to exhale. The town never did quite forget what happened on that street. Dutton didn't die, but he rode south, and word was, he didn't stop until the edge of the desert swallowed him. No one else came. Maybe the message was clear, or maybe silence had finally bought peace. One afternoon, Clara stood on the back porch with a tin basin full of laundry, and watched the wind move through the grass in slow ripples. She thought of the first time she'd seen Jonah's face, the way his eyes had carried something old, not broken, but buried. She thought of that letter again, the one she never sent, and wondered what kind of woman she might have been if that man had said yes. Would she have lived soft? Would she have been spared the dust and blood and weight of standing alone? Number. She knew better now. That letter, folded and burned, hadn't been rejection. It had been release. That night, under a sky thick with stars, Jonah reached for her hand, not like he needed to claim it, just to feel it there, solid, warm, choosing him again. She leaned into his shoulder and whispered, "Still quiet out here." He nodded once. "The kind that stays, maybe?" A coyote called in the far hills, and Clara smiled faintly, eyes on the horizon, because she understood something the West had been trying to teach her all along. You don't survive out here by being harder than the land. You survive by belonging to it. And this time, it belonged to her too.